My name is Butch Delaney, and welcome to Lesson 6 of the Bible series, I'll Bet You Didn't Know. In this series, we're going through the Bible looking for some of the obscure, amazing, and downright strange things that you may have never heard. Today's lesson is all about Goliath, the giant. We all know the story. It's been used forever as a Jack and the Giant kind of story, though this one is real. A young Jewish shepherd boy topples a huge foe. No one would have thought that possible. Here are a few things about the Philistines that I'll bet you never knew. You may know that there were 5 major Philistine cities, all on the seacoast, near what we know today as Tel Aviv. But do you know where they originated? Were they ever friendly with the Jews? Were they even included in the list of nations that Joshua was given to identify which nations needed to be destroyed? Were they the major enemy of the Jews? In another lesson later, we may talk about their fish god, who was named Dagon. Whenever I hear a discussion about David, it's always that he is the underdog in this fight. He was the weaker of the 2 characters, and we often use him as an example of what someone in a weak position can do if they stand up against the giants of the day. Well, I'm here to tell you that we might have missed the truth of this story completely. It was never David the weak one against the strong and gigantic Goliath. It was always David the strong one against the weak Goliath. Now, I'm not removing God's help for David from this picture. Surely he was with David and gave him the capability to do the job that he did, but we often overlook his personal capabilities and his training. It is if his life had been lived for this moment, and God had been a big part of that story all along. We tend to see David as just a kid, not a warrior, not prepared for battle, and we see the antagonist, Goliath, as having all the strengths. But you will find out in this lesson, we may have had it wrong from the beginning. It was Goliath who was the weak one. Goliath was a Philistine of Gath. Now you can see the 5 capital cities of the Philistines, and those were known as the Pentapolis. And they originally were seafaring people, probably of a Phoenician background, who settled near the coast in Judea long before the Israelites even conquered it and moved in. At first, they were friendly to the Jews. Abraham and Isaac both made treaties with them. And in Genesis 15, they did not make the list of nations that were to be conquered. But there's a reason why, and we'll get to that next. I'll bet you did not know that the Bible never prefixes the word Philistines with the word the. In all the verses where they're mentioned, it only says Philistines. It doesn't say the Philistines. For example, we went out today and fought Philistines. What do you think that would have indicated? What would have meant not to call them the Philistines? Well, it would mean that the Jews did not consider them a kind of sect or a distinct group of people. They were just Philistines. It was a common term for the Jews to use to refer to anyone who was uncouth and barbaric and hostile to the Jews. They were just considered non-Israelites, not a nation. Does this give you any different feeling about them? I think you can see that they were the Israelites' main adversary during this period. All of the great Jewish warriors fought with them: Samson, Saul, David, and Jonathan. They are mentioned 250 times in the Old Testament, way more than any other nation. Eventually, they did lose their independence, but it wasn't to the Jews. Instead, it was to the Assyrians. But unlike the Jews, they never returned from captivity. By the 5th century, they're no longer considered a distinct ethnic group. Zephaniah called them those who live by the sea and promised their destruction. I'll bet you've never heard that the land between the seacoast, which is a coastal plain and very low and flat, and the land in which the Jews settled near Jerusalem and Bethlehem, as well as all of the land west of the Jordan and near the Sea of Galilee, is unique. There are many ridges that were bunched up in an area, and they all point east and west. So if you were traveling north and south before there were roads and highways, you might have to go east or west for miles before you can find a way to advance north and south. These ridges are known as the Shevela. It's an area full of valleys between tall ridges, and there are many of them. But the ridges provided a distinct advantage to the Jews. The Jordan River and the Sea of Galilee was on their right. The Shevela on their left meant that anyone coming to fight them from the north, like Syria, or from the south, like Egypt, would have a very difficult time getting to them. Well, one of the valleys in the Shevela close to Jerusalem is the Valley of Elah. It is a flat plain that's about 5 miles in length, about a 1/2 mile wide at its widest point. And it lies between the Philistine city of Gath and the Jewish city of Jerusalem. And there's a small brook running through the valley, which you can see even today if you go there and visit. A large telecom site, a satellite array, was built there a few years ago on one of the ridges. Farmland has been planted all along the valley. This flat plain is where the Philistines chose to challenge Israel at the time of King Saul and the young boy David. Now, in the hills above the valley are beautiful terebinth trees. They are a kind of oak tree of sorts. At one end of the valley, as it nears Bethlehem, there's a cave where David and his men will use to get away from King Saul for a period. It's called the Cave of Adullam. And Jerusalem is a mere 10 miles due east. Bethlehem is even closer to the southeast. This is the valley where Goliath and the army of the Philistines chose to challenge Israel. Now, many battles and skirmishes had been fought there for years before. The Jews and King Saul lined up on the right side of the valley, and the Philistines lined up on the left. Now, Goliath would go down in the valley and taunt them. "Come down to me, and I will kill you all." I'm sure the Jews were deadly afraid of the giant man. He could have been 9 feet tall and huge. No one from the Jews came forth to challenge him. Everyone was afraid of the giant. But if they knew what you and I will learn from this lesson, they would not have been so fearful. Goliath the giant was not at all as fear-worthy as the Jews imagined him to be. They feared the idea of him, a 9-foot infantry soldier carrying a huge shield and a sword that weighed 10 times what their sword weighed. Who could possibly defeat him? It's helpful to understand how warfare was conducted at the time of King Saul and thereafter. Each army was comprised of several kinds of soldiers. First came the heavy infantry. Now, these guys were beefy, muscle-bound foot soldiers, heavily armored to withstand the blows of hand-to-hand combat. They used shields for protection. They used spears and swords for offensive power. Just understand that infantry soldiers are only effective in hand-to-hand combat. Their swords can only reach out 4 or 5 feet in front of them. They do make up the bulk of the armed forces of the day, though, and sometimes the sheer number of your infantry will win the battle. But they are the ones who suffer the most casualties in war. Next are the cavalry, horse-bound soldiers. Their armor is not as strong as infantry armor. They have to be lighter since they're riding on horses, but they're also armored. Most of their fighting is also done with swords and lances and spears, and they also are up close and personal fighters. But their horses give them a distinct advantage. And no war could be won without artillery support. There are two sources of artillery. There were the archers and the slingers. The archers all tend to stay back away from the main line of swordsmen, and they fight using the bows and arrows for the most part, and they will use knives and bludgeons if they are ever caught up in hand-to-hand combat. But they will hold their position as the enemy advances, but they will turn and will flee to more safe and distant places when the fighting gets hot. They have less armor than others in the group for that reason. They will often pull back and establish the second front away from the infantry fighters, but close enough for their arrows to attack. And no self-respecting army of the day would be without their slingers. Slingers use a sling, or what we realize today as a kind of a slingshot, and they direct a shower of rocks at their enemies. Slingers have light armor as well, and they also will retreat to a distance if they are pushed by the attackers. These fighters have an almost unbelievable ability to hit their targets at long distances. Accuracy, after all, is what will keep them alive. Learning to throw a rock from a sling is one defensive technique that even girls could engage in on farms around their homes. Slingers were an amazingly accurate and deadly in an army. So let's talk a little bit more about their weaponry, the sling. David was too young to be in the army, but he was already very proficient with the sling. He used it to protect his sheep and cattle from the wolves, the foxes, and other predators, and it was common for a slinger to bring down birds mid-flight. That is just how accurate they are. Now the sling can be swung at tremendous speeds. It'll make 6 or 7 revolutions per second. And the rock that is released mid-swing flies almost as fast as an arrow from one of today's composite bows, considerably over 100 miles an hour. Faster certainly than a baseball in a major league pitcher's hand. And they could be thrown for long distances, as far as 1,300 feet. This group of fighters were very important to the army. Now we tend to underestimate the sling. Our closest understanding of it is a toy slingshot, but these weapons are nothing like the slingshot. Recent research has proven that a sling-thrown rock has the stopping power of a .44 Magnum. It's hard to believe, but it's true. And this valley was full of native rocks that they could use. The rocks in this valley were barium sulfate rocks, or sometimes referred to as barite rocks. These rocks weighed almost twice what a normal rock would weigh. That meant almost twice the stopping power. Clearly, a thrown barite rock could take off the top of someone's skull. We should talk about rocks for just a second. Barite is an interesting rock formation, and living close to Oklahoma, you probably are familiar with barite rocks, which are made of the element barium sulfide and sand. Now, these are delicate and easily broken rocks that look like roses. Jenny and I have a few at home, and you probably do too. But the rocks at the Valley of Elah have barium sulfate, but also other harder, denser materials mixed in. They are very dense, hard to break, and extremely heavy. When David picks up the 5 rocks to use in his fight, I'm sure he picked up barite rocks from that stream bed. Now, we tend to think of David as the underdog, the improbable winner in any fight. He's just a kid, probably 14 or 15, not a battle-tested warrior. But he'd been trained for war all of his life at home on the farm. He was a shepherd who tended his flock and depended upon his slinging skill. He told Saul he once killed a lion and also a bear. And he didn't even mention the coyotes, foxes, and wolves that he killed, almost as not worth mentioning. He must have been extremely accurate with his sling. Now, being a slinger, he recognized that he was no challenge up close to an armored warrior with a sword and a spear. But not having heavy armor, he was faster and he could strategically retreat when it was necessary. And he also knew that he could bring down Goliath with a well-placed rock at his temple or his brow, thrown from a safe distance. What's a tall man next to a strong lion anyway? Is he more threatening than a wild bear? So David said, "Yeah, I think I can do it." So we always teach our children how outgunned David was, how God gave him extra protection and extra capability. And while this may be true, and even David admitted that that God was to be given all the credit, he was very skilled for combat, and he was a worthy adversary for Goliath. He certainly was brave enough, or more so than the rest of Saul's army, because they all feared the giant. Goliath, on the other hand, wanted and even needed an up-close and personal infantry fight. King Saul thought David intended to fight this way. Remember, he gave him his best armor and his heavy sword, but David refused that. Goliath needed David to come to him, and so he taunted him, "Come here and fight me." But David knew better. Now, just as much as we undervalue David's abilities, we also give Goliath way too much credit, especially if you look at the signs that indicated his weaknesses. First, notice that he had an attendant lead him into the valley. Was this just for show, or was it for another reason? Notice also that he did not begin taunting David on the way down to him. Surely he could have chided him, called him names, and called him a boy from further away. But the Bible says he kept coming closer and closer, and then he began to taunt David. I wonder why. And he also said to David, "Who am I? A dog that you would come to fight with me with sticks?" Well, David wasn't even carrying one sword that that Goliath would have referred to as a stick, and he certainly wasn't carrying two of them. So why would Goliath do that? Well, it seems that this giant suffered from what many giants like him before and after have suffered, a rare medical condition called gigantism or acromegaly. This disease starts early in a boy or girl's life. The pituitary gland, which is responsible for the growth hormone, becomes overactive because of a tumor. It begins producing too much of the growth hormone, and the child becomes a giant. Here's a picture of Robert Wadlow, an almost 9-foot acromegaly sufferer back in the 1930s and 40s in America. As a youngster, his pituitary gland began producing and overproducing the growth hormone, and he grew to almost twice the size of his father. Like the other acromegaly giants, they're beset with problems like weaknesses, deafness, joint pain, mobility issues, and almost all of them suffer from serious eye problems. Seeing double is a common one. They see two of everything, and their field of view is often very limited. Perhaps you're familiar with Andre the Giant. He was a movie star from a few years ago. He was also an acromegaly sufferer. Look at the size of his hand compared to Ali's face. He was a professional wrestler for the most part of his career, and he even starred in a few movies. You may know him as Fezzik the giant in The Princess Bride. I'll bet you didn't know this. Back a few years ago, some scientific writings were published that suggested the symptoms that Goliath showed were very consistent with those of one suffering from acromegaly. He simply could not see well. He probably saw two of everything, and he was slow. He probably had joint pain, and this is why he needed an attendant with him to point the giant in the right direction to fight against David. All this time, Saul's warriors had feared Goliath. If they had only known, they would have taken care of Goliath before David ever arrived. But they gave the giant more respect than he deserved. That alone is the surprise ending to the story. But there may have been more. The Jews hold to the tradition that Goliath was a descendant of a man named Rapha in their distant past. Rapha probably was the father or ancestor of the giant Og of Bashan, who lay in a bed that was made of iron that was 14 feet long. And Rapha was thought to be an ancestor of Goliath of Gath as well. Saul records a giant of Gath, which is Goliath's hometown, who was a descendant of Rapha. But Samuel said he had 6 fingers on each hand and 6 fingers and 6 toes on each foot. If Goliath was a descendant of Rapha, then it would be possible that he too had the condition that's known as polydactyly. Polydactyly is not an extremely rare condition. Hound Dog Taylor was born in Natchez, Mississippi in 1917, and he had a 6th finger that he could use in playing guitar. He played the guitar in the 1950s in Chicago. I personally had a friend when I was a boy that had 2 thumbs on one hand, a regular sized hand, and one that had a smaller one with a little thumb that grew out just out of his knuckle. And he could really pinch you with that polydactyl thumb. Malcolm Gladworth, a writer, did a tech talk in which he recounted the story of Goliath, and he covered much of what we're talking about today. And he ended his talk with this thought: giants are never what they seem. It's always a very good idea to check your emotions and your fears as you confront any problem that you think seems to be a giant problem. Perhaps you'll find that you're giving it more credit than it deserves. Thank you for watching this video to the end, and join us in the future episodes of this series.